A lone figure stands motionless in the gray light before dawn. This is the image of a samurai burned into history, a symbol of ultimate discipline, but the stillness is deceptive. It hides a lifetime of relentless, daily exertion. What did it actually take to forge such a warrior? We often see the myth, but we rarely understand the machine behind it. By the end of this, you will know the exact, grueling daily routine that transformed a person into a living weapon. We will uncover how they trained not just with swords, but with poetry, and why a tea ceremony was as vital as sparring. What does true discipline look like when your life depends on it? The machine began with a purpose far beyond the battlefield. To understand their training, you must first forget the solitary swordsman. A samurai was a pillar of a complex society. In times of peace, which were many, he was a local governor, a tax collector, a dispute mediator, and a land manager. His sword stayed sheathed while he balanced ledgers and enforced his lord's laws. He was expected to be literate, often composing poetry and studying philosophy, particularly the stern codes of Bushido and the meditative principles of Zen Buddhism. This was not a hobby, it was a core requirement. Why? Because a leader who understands only violence is a danger to everyone, including himself. Their daily regimen, therefore, was not a narrow path to combat efficiency. It was a broad, relentless curriculum designed to forge a balanced human being, one whose judgment was as sharp as his blade. The goal was Bunbu Ryodo, the twin ways of the pen and the sword. A true samurai could write a poignant poem in the morning, settle a village dispute at noon, and if necessary, face a life or death duel in the evening with the same calm, clear mind. Their training was holistic because their world demanded it. Every aspect of their day, from the physical to the artistic, was a thread woven into the same unbreakable fabric of character. So when we picture that still figure at dawn, we must see not just a warrior waiting for a fight, but a complete person preparing for an entire life of responsibility. The day began in darkness, long before the sun touched the horizon. A rigid schedule governed every hour, a framework of discipline so absolute it became second nature. This was not about convenience, it was about control, starting with the most basic human instincts. The first act was often a shock to the system. A samurai would rise and immediately perform misogi, a ritual of purification using cold water. He might pour it over his head or stand beneath a waterfall if one was near. This was not for cleanliness alone. The biting cold was a brutal, immediate test of will. It shocked the body awake, silenced complaining thoughts, and forged a moment of pure mental clarity. It was a daily reminder that comfort was an enemy, and that mastering discomfort was the first step to mastering anything else. Following this, he would move to a quiet space for meditation. This was not a casual few minutes of quiet. It was a deep, focused practice, often rooted in Zen. He would sit in silence, legs crossed, back straight, and work to empty his mind of clutter, ambition, and fear. The goal was mushin, a state of no mind, where reaction flows without the hesitation of thought. In the stillness, he prepared his spirit for the chaos the day might bring. Before engaging with the world, he would then turn to the spiritual. He approached the kamadana, the small household shrine, to pay respects to the kami, the spirits, and to his ancestors. He would make a small offering, perhaps rice or sake, clap his hands twice to attract the divine attention, and bow in silent prayer. This ritual connected him to his lineage and his duties. It was a humble acknowledgement that his strength was not his alone, but part of a greater continuum. He asked for protection and guidance, and in doing so, reinforced the weight of the legacy he carried. Before a single physical exercise began, before a sword was even touched, his day was already a rigorous training ground for the mind and spirit. The foundation was set not with steel, but with silence, cold water, and reverence. With his mind and spirit prepared, the samurai then turned to the relentless task of forging his body into a capable instrument. This physical conditioning was brutally pragmatic, designed for one purpose: battlefield survival. It began not with weapons, but with the body itself. Each morning included a rigorous session of calisthenics, what they called teso. This involved deep squats, lunges, stretches, and dynamic movements to build functional strength and flexibility. He needed to be able to spring from the ground, change direction instantly, and maintain balance on uneven terrain. Running was a cornerstone, but it was never a simple jog. He would run for miles, often wearing his full armor or carrying weighted gear to simulate the exhausting reality of moving to battle or pursuing a foe. Imagine the strain, the heat, the sheer weight of lacquered plates and a helmet bearing down with every step. This built not just stamina, but also the specific muscular endurance needed to fight effectively while encumbered. Swimming was another critical, and often overlooked, skill. A samurai was expected to be able to cross rivers and moats while wearing his armor. They practiced swimming in full gear, learning to move efficiently through water despite the tremendous drag. This was a matter of tactical necessity, a way to flank an enemy or escape a trap. Endurance was further tested through static, strenuous postures. He might hold a deep horse stance for what felt like an eternity, or balance on one leg while extending a weapon, building the iron discipline of muscles that must not tremble at a crucial moment. Every ache, every burning muscle was a lesson. This daily grind was not for athletic glory or an impressive physique. It was a direct translation of need. A stronger leg meant a more stable stance in a duel. Greater lung capacity meant you could outlast your opponent in a prolonged skirmish. The ability to swim in armor meant the difference between life and a watery grave. His body was being sculpted, day by day, into a tool as reliable and as essential as the sword he would soon pick up. Only after this foundation of body and mind was laid would the samurai finally reach for his sword. This moment was sacred. The katana was not merely a tool. It was considered the very soul of the warrior, an extension of his spirit and his honor. To train with it was to engage in the highest form of personal development, a practice called kenjutsu. The first lesson was always one of profound respect. He would bow to the blade before drawing it, handling it with a ritualized care that bordered on reverence. This set the tone for everything that followed, a constant reminder that this instrument of life and death demanded absolute focus. The training began not with dramatic clashes, but with stillness. He would assume a kami, a fundamental combat stance. There were several, each for a different purpose. Perhaps the most common was chuden no kami, the middle stance, where the sword point is leveled directly at the opponent's throat or eyes. This was a posture of both threat and defense, offering no obvious opening. Holding this position for extended periods was its own kind of torture, training the muscles to remain perfectly controlled under the weapon's weight. Then came movement, the art of ashisabaki or footwork. A samurai did not simply step, he glided. He practiced shifting his weight smoothly, pivoting on the balls of his feet, advancing and retreating in a balanced flow. The goal was to maintain perfect stability while closing distance or creating space, never allowing his feet to cross or become tangled. His connection to the ground was as important as his grip on the sword. But the true heart of daily practice, the monotonous grind that built genius, was subari. These were basic, solitary cutting motions performed not hundreds, but thousands of times. He would stand alone, perhaps before a rising sun, and execute the same perfect downward cut, over and over and over again. The aim was not to hit a target, but to eliminate all error from the motion itself. Every muscle, from the feet pushing off the ground, through the hips twisting, to the shoulders and arms guiding the blade, had to fire in flawless sequence. The sword had to follow an exact, efficient arc, stopping precisely where intended without a tremble. Through this endless repetition, the movement was burned past conscious thought into the very fibers of his being. It became pure muscle memory, so that in the chaos of combat, his body would react with perfect instinctual form. This was the secret, the daily devotion that turned a piece of steel into a part of him. Yet all those solitary cuts were merely preparation for the unpredictable reality of an opponent. This is where the training transformed from internal discipline into external dialogue, through the use of wooden and bamboo swords. The samurai would exchange his live blade for a bakken, a solid oak replica with the same weight and balance, or a shinai, a bundle of bamboo strips bound together to create a safer, flexible practice sword. These tools allowed for something crucial: contact. With a partner, the samurai entered the world of kata. These were not the solo forms we might imagine today, but intricate, pre-arranged sequences practiced in pairs. One partner would take the role of the attacker, executing a specific strike. The other, the defender, would respond with a precise block, parry, and counterattack. Every step, every angle of the blade, and every breath was choreographed. To an outsider, it might look like a slow, ritualized dance, but for the practitioners, it was a high-stakes conversation. Each kata was a living textbook, encoding the principles of real combat. The primary lesson was mai, the critical concept of combative distance. Through endless repetition, the samurai learned to feel the exact space between himself and his partner's sword tip. He internalized the distance from which he was safe, the distance from which he could be struck, and the single, perfect step that would move him from defense to decisive offense. Kata drilled the timing of entering this vulnerable space, the moment an opponent committed to an attack, when they were most extended and least able to change their motion. It taught how to deflect a blade not with brute strength, but with a subtle redirection of its energy, using the opponent's own force against them. They practiced responses to attacks from every angle, high and low, building a library of instinctual reactions. This was the bridge between the perfect, empty form of solo practice and the chaotic truth of a duel. In the controlled, repetitive flow of kata, they learned to read intention in the slightest shift of a shoulder or the gleam in an eye, training their perception to be as sharp as their cutting technique. But mastery of distance and timing in a known duel was only half the battle. A samurai's deadliest moment often came without warning, in the space of a single breath. This demanded a discipline all its own, the art of aijutsu, the quick draw. Unlike the extended engagements of kenjutsu, aijutsu was about a single, perfect action, resolving a life or death confrontation in the time it takes to blink. Its purpose was absolute, for surprise encounters in a crowded room or the tense beginning of a formal duel. The scenario was always one of extreme disadvantage, starting with the sword sheathed. An opponent stands before you, their blade already drawn and ready. Your only chance is to draw, cut, and neutralize the threat in one seamless, explosive motion. The practice of aijutsu was a study in controlled violence, broken down into precise, fluid stages, each practiced until it became a single thought. From a calm, often seated position, the samurai's hand would find the hilt of his sword. His focus was not on his opponent's eyes, which could deceive, but on their center, their torso, sensing the intention to move. At the exact moment of attack, or the perceived opening, he would act. The first motion was not a pull, but a push. With his left hand still anchoring the scabbard, he would push the sword's guard forward with his right thumb, breaking the blade's seal in its saya, just enough to create an opening. Then, in one continuous flow, he would draw the blade upward and out, using the curve of the scabbard's mouth to guide it into a cutting arc. His body would rise, turning at the hips, and the blade would not stop moving. The draw became the cut, a horizontal or diagonal slash aimed to disable the opponent's sword arm or strike a vital point, all in the same motion. There was no pause, no reset. The final and perhaps most difficult part was the return. After the cut, without looking, he would flick the blood from the blade with a sharp wrist motion, a practice called shibari, and then, with equal precision, guide the point back into the scabbard's opening and slide it home. This entire sequence, from stillness to lethal strike and back to stillness, was practiced for thousands of hours, seated, kneeling, and standing. The goal was not mere speed, but smoothness, eliminating any jerk or hesitation that would betray the action. Every muscle had to work in perfect harmony, a physical haiku of extreme efficiency. To master aijutsu was to live in that razor's edge between peace and violence, always prepared to translate a single moment of danger into a single, definitive, and final motion. Yet the katana was just the heart of a much broader arsenal. A true samurai was a master of multiple weapons, each with its own purpose and demanding a unique form of daily discipline. His adaptability was his greatest strength, allowing him to dominate any range of combat. For close quarters fighting, especially indoors where the long katana was cumbersome, he trained extensively with the wakizashi. This shorter companion sword was more than a backup. It was a tool for tight spaces and the grim finality of seppuku. Practicing with it honed different reflexes, emphasizing swift, tight cuts and precise thrusts in confined areas. But to engage an enemy before they ever got close, a samurai turned to the yumi, the asymmetrical longbow. This was not the weapon of a distant archer, but often of a mounted warrior. Kenjutsu, the art of the bow, required immense strength and a counterintuitive technique. He would draw the bow, which could be over 2 meters tall, to his ear, not his cheek, using a unique grip where the thumb pulled the string. Accuracy from a galloping horse was the pinnacle of this skill, a testament to balance, focus, and raw power that could decide a battle before a single sword was drawn. On the chaotic battlefield, however, the primary weapon was often not a sword at all. It was the yari, a straight-headed spear. This was the weapon of formation and reach. Daily drills with the yari taught a samurai to fight as part of a unit, using its length to keep enemies at a distance, targeting gaps in armor with powerful thrusts, and working in unison with fellow warriors. Its use built different muscles and a different spatial awareness, one focused on controlling a lane of attack rather than executing a singular cut. Similarly, the naginata, a polearm with a curved blade, offered a devastating blend of cutting power and reach. It was a versatile tool, used to slice at opponents from a safe distance, dismount cavalry by cutting at the horse's legs, and defend strategic positions. Training with it was a dynamic, sweeping exercise, teaching the warrior to manage a long, heavy weapon with fluid, circular motions. This daily rotation through different weapons was not about collecting skills like trophies. It was a practical response to the unpredictable nature of conflict. One day you might need the precise lethality of the katana in a duel. The next you might be holding a line with a spear against a cavalry charge, or picking off a commander from 100 yards with a bow. By forcing his body and mind to adapt to the spear's thrust, the bow's draw, and the sword's cut, the samurai ensured he was never at a disadvantage. His daily training was a constant rehearsal for every possible scenario, making him not just a swordsman, but a complete and formidable instrument of war, ready for anything the battlefield could throw at him. But the ultimate expression of a warrior's harmony with his tools was not on the ground, it was in the saddle. Baijutsu, the way of the horse, transformed the samurai from a formidable fighter into a terrifying force of nature. His horse was not a mere vehicle, it was a partner in combat, and their unity was a product of relentless daily training. The first and most critical skill was learning to control the animal with almost no use of the hands. A samurai would spend hours riding with the reins tied to the saddle or even held in his teeth. He learned to guide his mount with subtle shifts of his weight, the pressure of his knees, and the tone of his voice. This freed his hands for the true purpose, wielding a bow or a spear from a galloping platform. The bond had to be so intuitive that the horse responded to the slightest cue, turning, stopping, or charging as if it were an extension of the rider's own body. This allowed for the most demanding test of all, yabusame, or mounted archery. Picture the scene. The samurai, clad in armor, spurs his horse to a full gallop down a narrow track. In a matter of seconds, he must nock an arrow, draw the massive yumi bow to full extension, aim and release, all while maintaining perfect balance on a moving, bouncing animal. His target is not a large, stationary one, but a series of small wooden boards placed alongside the track. The timing is everything. He must release the arrow in the split second when all 4 of the horse's hooves are off the ground during its stride, the moment of greatest stability. To hit the target, he must account for the horse's speed, the wind, and the rhythm of its gait, synthesizing these variables into a single, fluid motion. It was an immense challenge, a breathtaking display of focus, strength, and symbiotic trust. Fighting effectively from horseback with a spear or sword presented a different set of problems. Every strike carried the multiplied force of the horse's momentum, but controlling that power required immense core strength and precise timing. A missed thrust could unbalance the rider, and a poorly executed turn could leave him vulnerable. Daily drills involved charging at straw dummies, learning to strike with lethal accuracy while managing the horse's movement and his own shifting center of gravity. This was the pinnacle of martial versatility, where the warrior's skill with weapons merged completely with his mastery of an intelligent, powerful animal. To face a samurai on horseback was to face a single, fluid entity of bone, muscle, steel, and raw speed. Yet, for all the speed of a horse or the precision of a sword, the true tide of a battlefield was often turned by a forest of points. The yari, the Japanese spear, was the unsung hero of samurai warfare, a weapon of brutal simplicity and terrifying reach. While the katana captured the soul, the yari won the wars. Its training, called kenjutsu, was a discipline of distance and formation. A typical yari featured a straight, razor-sharp head mounted on a long wooden shaft, sometimes over 3 meters in length. Its primary technique was the thrust, a direct, powerful lunge aimed with the full weight of the body behind it. This was not a fencing flick. It was a piston-driven strike meant to punch through armor plates or find the gaps between them. Daily drills focused on perfecting this single, devastating motion. Samurai would practice thrusting at hanging straw targets, learning to extend their arms and body in one fluid line, driving the point home and retracting it quickly to defend against a counterattack. The true power of the yari, however, was realized not in duels, but in ranks. On the battlefield, samurai armed with yari would form tight formations, presenting a wall of gleaming steel points to an advancing enemy. This was a weapon of collective discipline, where each warrior had to trust his comrades and maintain his position. Training emphasized coordinated movements, advancing and retreating as a unit, and using the spear's length to keep cavalry and infantry at bay. It was a relentless, grinding form of combat that valued steadfast courage and unwavering trust in the line you held with your brothers in arms. In contrast to the yari's directness stood the naginata, a weapon of elegant and sweeping devastation. This was a polearm with a curved, single-edged blade mounted on a long shaft, resembling a sword on a pole. Its techniques, known as naginata jutsu, were fluid and circular, built around powerful cuts, slashes, and hooks. A master of the naginata would not just thrust. They would spin the weapon around their body, using its length and weight to generate tremendous cutting force. This made it exceptionally versatile. On the battlefield, it was a terror against cavalry. A samurai could swing the naginata in wide arcs to strike at the legs of horses, crippling the mount and sending the rider tumbling, or he could use its reach to cut down at infantry from a safer distance. Its design also allowed for defensive maneuvers, where the shaft could be used to block incoming strikes before a swift, cutting counterattack was launched. Interestingly, the naginata became famously associated with two distinct groups. It was the weapon of choice for the warrior monks of mountain monasteries, who used its long reach to defend temple grounds against samurai incursions. Perhaps more famously, it was the primary martial art of samurai women. While they were not expected to fight on the front lines, women of the samurai class were trained to protect the household in their husband's absence. The naginata's longer reach allowed a defender to engage an enemy without needing the raw physical strength required for a sword duel, leveraging technique and leverage over brute force. Training with it cultivated balance, timing, and spatial awareness, skills that were as much about defending the home as they were about personal discipline. So while the yari was the backbone of the army, the naginata was the guardian of the temple and the hearth, a reminder that the samurai's world of war extended into every corner of their lives, shaping the training of every member of their society. The battlefield clamor of spear and sword fell away to a different kind of discipline, one of profound silence and immense tension. Kenjutsu, the way of the bow, was an art that married brute force with spiritual serenity. The weapon itself, the yumi, was a masterpiece of contradiction. Unlike any other bow in the world, it was strikingly asymmetrical, with the grip positioned about 2/3 of the way down its length, which could exceed 2 meters. This design was not an aesthetic choice, it was pure physics. Crafted from laminates of bamboo and wood, this shape allowed it to be shot from horseback or from a kneeling position without the lower tip striking the ground, and it distributed the draw force more evenly, making it incredibly powerful and surprisingly smooth to release. To draw it required immense strength, often over 100 pounds of pull, but the technique was everything. The archer did not pull the string to his cheek as in Western archery. Instead, he drew it past his ear, anchoring it beside his head, using a unique thumb grip protected by a leather glove. This longer draw length unleashed tremendous energy into the arrow, capable of piercing armor at a considerable distance. Yet hitting a target was almost secondary. The true heart of kenjutsu was in the ritual, a moving meditation shared with Zen practice. Every action was deliberate and symbolic. The archer would approach the firing line with solemn grace, nock the arrow with precise movements, and raise the bow. His focus turned inward, breathing became the anchor. He would inhale deeply as he drew the bow, holding that peak of tension, not as strain, but as a state of total awareness. In that moment, the archer, the bow, the target, and the universe were meant to become one. The release was not a conscious decision to let go, but a natural consequence of perfect form and empty mind, a state known as zanshin, remaining spirit. The arrow would fly almost as if it shot itself. This spiritual focus had devastating practical application. In warfare, the samurai archer was often a mounted terror. He could loose arrows with shocking accuracy while guiding his horse at full gallop, a skill that required his meditation to extend to his partnership with the animal. Arrows were used to break enemy formations, pick off commanders, and provide covering fire. But kenjutsu also transcended the battlefield. It was central to court rituals and ceremonial competitions, where hitting the target was less important than demonstrating flawless, dignified form. In hunting, it connected the warrior to the natural world, a test of patience and stillness against a living, moving quarry. The daily practice of drawing that great asymmetrical bow, then, was never just about building shoulder strength. It was a daily exercise in unifying the body's power with the mind's stillness, proving that the most potent strike began not in the muscles, but in a breath of perfect calm. But even stripped of every weapon, a samurai was never truly disarmed. His final line of defense was his own body, trained in the brutal, pragmatic art of jujutsu. This was not a sport, nor was it about flashy kicks or cinematic punches. Jujutsu, the gentle art, was a system of devastating efficiency born from a simple, terrifying premise. How do you defeat an armed and possibly armored opponent when you have nothing but your hands? The answer lay in leverage, balance, and ruthless anatomy. Strikes were secondary, designed to stun or create openings. The core of jujutsu was about closing the distance against a sword, controlling the opponent's weapon arm, and then using their own momentum against them. A samurai would train in a vast array of throws, where a subtle pull or a hip check could send a heavier foe crashing to the ground. He practiced joint locks, applying precise, painful pressure to wrists, elbows, and shoulders to force a surrender or break a limb. Chokes and pins were essential for immobilizing an enemy once on the ground, rendering them helpless without needing to kill them. Every technique was a physics problem, solving for how a smaller person could overcome a larger, stronger, or better equipped adversary. But this was just the foundation. The real test came when the combatants were not in simple robes, but encased in 60 pounds of iron and lacquer. This specific, grueling discipline was known as yoroi kumiuchi, grappling in full armor. The dynamic changed completely. The heavy, rigid plates made typical joint locks almost impossible, and the helmet limited vision and hearing. Striking the armor with a fist was pointless, like punching a stone wall. Yoroi kumiuchi became a clanking, exhausting struggle of balance and opportunism. The goal was not a fancy throw, but a simple, heavy takedown. Combatants would grab onto each other's armor, the cords, the helmet crest, anything they could use for leverage. They fought for superior position, trying to unbalance their foe and drive them to the earth. Once on the ground, the fight was far from over. In that tangled metallic heap, the final tool emerged, a small dagger called a yoroi doshi or a tanto. This blade was designed with a strong, thick point to pierce the gaps in armor at the armpit, the throat, or the visor slit. The grim conclusion of a yoroi kumiuchi match was often one warrior pinning the other, finding a seam in the steel, and driving the dagger home. So their unarmed training was the ultimate contingency plan, a stark acknowledgement that battles could dissolve into the most primal, intimate chaos. It ensured that even when everything else was lost, their hands still knew how to fight. Yet a body honed to perfection was useless without a mind of equal steel. The most critical training happened not on the training grounds, but in the silent spaces between thoughts. For a samurai, mastering his own mind was the ultimate martial art. This internal discipline centered on a profound practice, zazen, or seated Zen meditation. Each day, after the shock of cold water and before the clatter of weapons, he would retreat to a quiet space, assume the lotus position, and simply sit. This was not relaxation. It was a rigorous exercise in mental purification. The goal was to observe the endless stream of thoughts, fears, and desires without becoming attached to them, to let them pass like clouds across a still sky. Through this daily practice, he cultivated a laser-like focus and an unshakable emotional calm. In the chaos of battle, where a moment of panic or anger could mean death, this trained stillness was his greatest armor. He learned to face the imminent reality of his own demise not with bravado, but with a quiet acceptance. This mental fortitude was what allowed him to walk onto the dueling ground with steady hands and a clear heart. But zazen was building towards something even more profound, a state known as mushin, often translated as no mind. This is a concept easily misunderstood. It does not mean being empty-headed or unconscious. Instead, mushin is a state of pure, unobstructed awareness, where the self vanishes and action flows without the interference of deliberate thought. Imagine a musician lost in a perfect performance, their fingers flying across the instrument without conscious command, or a dancer whose movements are inseparable from the music. For the samurai, mushin was the pinnacle of combat effectiveness. In a duel, there is no time for internal monologue, no space for thinking, now I will parry, now I will counter. Any hesitation, any flicker of doubt, creates an opening. Through years of repetitive kata and solitary subari, the techniques were burned so deeply into his being that they became instinct. Then, through zazen, the mental chatter that could disrupt that instinct was quieted. The result was mushin. In that state, he did not fight the opponent, he responded to the situation itself. His body moved with the same effortless certainty as a leaf falling from a tree or water flowing around a stone. He perceived an attack not as a threat to be feared, but as a movement in space to be met with the appropriate, ingrained response. The sword seemed to move itself. This was the true secret behind the legendary speed and precision of the master swordsman. His daily meditation was not a separate spiritual hobby. It was direct training for the moment of truth. He was forging a mind as sharp, as calm, and as relentless as his blade. This relentless daily grind, from meditation to mounted archery, was held together by an invisible framework. Every drop of sweat, every perfect cut, every moment of silent focus was infused with a deeper purpose, guided by a strict moral compass known as bushido, the way of the warrior. This was not a written manual handed to new recruits. It was an unwritten code, a set of principles absorbed through action and example, forming the philosophical backbone of everything a samurai did. His training was not just to create a skilled fighter, but to forge a specific kind of person. The virtues of bushido were the true targets of his daily practice. Rectitude or gi was the uncompromising moral integrity to know right from wrong and act accordingly, even when it was difficult. This meant every action in training, from not cheating in a sparring match to honestly assessing one's own weaknesses, was a test of character. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act rightly in spite of it. Facing a training partner's wooden sword in a full-speed drill required this kind of courage. the bravery to stand in the path of potential pain in order to learn and improve. But bushido demanded more than just martial strength. Benevolence jin was the mercy and compassion a warrior was expected to show. A master might show benevolence by correcting a student with patience instead of anger, or a victorious samurai might spare a defeated foe who fought honorably. Respect, rei, governed all social interactions, from the deep bow to one's sensei to the respectful handling of a practice weapon. It was the oil that kept the machine of their strict society running smoothly. Honesty in Makoto meant utter sincerity in word and deed. A samurai's promise was considered as binding as steel, and in training, this meant being truthful about one's progress and limitations. Honor, meiyo, was the most precious possession, more valuable than life itself. Every training session was a chance to build it through diligent effort, and every potential action was weighed against whether it would bring shame to oneself or one's lord. Finally, loyalty, chugi, was the supreme virtue, the unwavering devotion to one's lord above all else, even family and personal safety. This loyalty was the engine that powered their service, making the grueling daily routine a form of devoted offering. So when a samurai performed 10,000 practice cuts, he was not just building muscle memory, he was cultivating the discipline for rectitude. When he sat in zazen, he was forging the calm necessary for true courage. When he bowed to his opponent before sparring, he was practicing respect. The dojo was a classroom for the soul, where the physical repetitions were simply the method for engraving these virtues onto the heart. The perfect sword stroke was meaningless if the hand that wielded it belonged to a dishonorable man. The battlefield of the mind was as demanding as any physical arena. After the clatter of weapons fell silent, the samurai would wash the sweat from his hands and turn to a different kind of sharpening. His role was not solely that of a warrior. He was a governor, a diplomat, a land manager. To fail in these duties was to bring shame as surely as losing a duel. This demanded the cultivation of bun, the literary and artistic arts, with the same intensity as bu, the martial arts. The ideal was bunbu ryodo, the twin paths of pen and sword, and it was pursued with daily rigor. His studies began with the foundational texts of statecraft and philosophy, the Chinese classics. He immersed himself in the works of Confucius, learning the principles of ethical governance, social hierarchy, and righteous leadership. He studied Sun Tzu's The Art of War, not just for its tactics, but for its deeper lessons on psychology, terrain, and the economics of conflict. This was not passive reading, it was active interrogation. He debated these texts with his tutors or fellow samurai, arguing their application to the management of his lands or the counsel he would give his lord. Mastery of these ideas was what separated a mere soldier from a true leader, someone who could build a stable domain in times of peace. Alongside this, he delved into Japanese literature and history, chronicles like the Tale of the Hike, which recounted the epic rise and fall of great clans. These stories were more than entertainment. They were case studies in loyalty, betrayal, strategic failure, and the fleeting nature of power. He learned the rhythms and aesthetics of his own culture by composing poetry, particularly the 31-syllable waka. This exercise forced a profound economy of language and emotion. In just a few lines, he had to capture the essence of a moment, the beauty of a landscape, or the depth of a feeling. The discipline of finding the perfect word mirrored the discipline of finding the perfect strike, both requiring elimination of all that was unnecessary. His hand was also trained in the art of shodo, calligraphy. With careful, controlled strokes of the brush, he practiced writing Chinese characters and Japanese script. This was meditation in motion, where a trembling hand or a distracted mind would ruin the work. The quality of one's handwriting was seen as a direct reflection of one's character, clear and bold or weak and indecisive. Even mathematics, or wasan, was a vital part of his curriculum. He needed to calculate the yields of his rice fields, manage the taxes owed to his lord, budget for the upkeep of his retainers, and plan the logistics for supplying a castle or an army. A miscalculation could lead to famine, bankruptcy, or a failed campaign. So his study desk held abacuses and geometry problems, tools for building and sustaining the world he was sworn to protect. This intellectual half of the day was not a soft counterbalance to his physical training. It was the other half of the same whole. The mind that could appreciate the subtle melancholy of a poem was the same mind that could anticipate an opponent's feint. The strategic thinking honed on a scroll of Sun Tzu was directly applicable to maneuvering troops on a map. The patience learned through a single stroke of calligraphy was the patience needed to hold a spear stance without wavering. He was being sculpted into a complete instrument of his society, capable of creating beauty, administering justice, and when necessary, deploying devastating force, all with the same calm, cultivated mind. The quiet intensity of the study desk found its parallel in the stillness of the tea room. To cultivate the mind was essential, but to refine the spirit was the ultimate safeguard against becoming a mere weapon. This is where the samurai's daily training took its most unexpected turn, into the serene world of cultural arts. These practices were not leisurely hobbies for their rare days off. They were considered vital disciplines, each a rigorous exercise in patience, focus, and aesthetic judgment. The first and perhaps most profound was Sado, the way of tea. The tea ceremony was a choreographed ritual of humility and mindfulness. Every movement was prescribed, from the way the bamboo whisk was held to the precise number of times the tea bowl was turned before drinking. The samurai, accustomed to commanding others, would here submit completely to the form. He would kneel on the tatami mat, his large, calloused hands performing these delicate, economical motions. The goal was to be fully present in each action, to wash the bowl with total attention, to hear the sound of the water boiling as if it were the only sound in the world. In that quiet, simplified space, the clutter of ambition, anger, or anxiety was meant to fall away. For a warrior whose life could end in an instant, the tea ceremony was a daily rehearsal for facing each moment with clarity and grace, a meditation on the beauty of the here and now. From the subtlety of tea, he might turn to the stark discipline of the brush. Sumi-e, ink wash painting, was an exercise in decisive focus and acceptance of imperfection. Using only black ink, ground by hand on a stone slab, and a few brushes, the artist sought to capture the essence of a subject, be it a bamboo stalk or a mountain landscape, with the fewest possible strokes. There was no room for hesitation or correction. Once the brush touched the paper, the mark was permanent. This trained the samurai to commit to an action with full conviction, to trust his trained instinct just as he would in a duel. A trembling line or a blot of ink was not a failure to be hidden, but a part of the work's unique character, a lesson in embracing the unpredictable outcome, or wabi-sabi, the beauty of impermanence and imperfection. Finally, there was ikebana, the art of flower arranging. Far more than simply putting flowers in a vase, ikebana was a philosophical exercise in space, line, and balance. The arranger, following strict schools of form, would select a few branches and blooms, considering their natural shape, the season, and the feeling they evoked. He would then carefully prune and position them in a holder, creating a miniature representation of the natural world, often emphasizing asymmetry and empty space. This practice cultivated a deep appreciation for nature's transient beauty, the understanding that a cherry blossom is most precious because it soon falls. For a samurai, whose own life was understood to be as fleeting, ikebana was a daily reminder to find harmony and meaning in the brief moment he was given. Together, these arts of tea, ink, and flowers were the counterweight to the sword. They honed sensitivity where combat demanded ruthlessness. They taught patience where war required speed, and they cultivated an eye for beauty to balance the reality of brutality. They ensured the warrior remained at his core, a complete and deeply human being. This carefully cultivated discipline found its home in a place of stark simplicity and profound order, the dojo. More than just a training hall, the dojo was a sacred space, a physical manifestation of the samurai's path. You would not find ornate decorations or comfortable furnishings. The floor was tatami mats, the walls were bare, and the air was often thick with the smell of sweat, wood, and straw. This austerity was deliberate. It removed all distraction, forcing the practitioner to confront only the task at hand and his own limitations. Within these bare walls operated a microcosm of samurai society, governed by an unshakable hierarchy that was the engine of all learning. At the pinnacle stood the sensei, the teacher. His authority was absolute and unquestioned. He was not merely an instructor, but a living repository of knowledge, a direct link to the lineage of masters who had perfected the art over generations. Students did not call him by name. They addressed him simply as sensei, a title of the deepest respect. His word was law, his correction was a gift, and his silence could be a more powerful lesson than any lecture. To question him openly would be a profound act of disrespect, not just to the man, but to the tradition itself. Learning flowed not through democratic discussion, but through meticulous observation, relentless repetition, and silent absorption. A student would watch the sensei demonstrate a technique, perhaps only once, and then spend weeks or months trying to replicate it, with corrections given only when the teacher deemed the student ready to hear them. This relationship forged a deep, almost spiritual bond, built on trust and the total surrender of the student's ego to the process. Supporting this central pillar was another critical dynamic, the relationship between senpai and kohai, the senior and junior students. This was not a casual friendship, it was a formalized structure of mentorship and duty. A kohai, a new or junior student, was expected to serve as senpai. He would arrive early to sweep the dojo, care for the equipment, and observe every rule of etiquette. In return, the senpai took responsibility for the kohai's basic training and integration. He would demonstrate techniques, offer initial corrections, and enforce the dojo's discipline. This system served multiple vital purposes. It relieved the sensei from managing every minor detail, allowing him to focus on higher-level instruction. It instilled humility in the newcomer, who had to earn his place through service. And for the senpai, teaching the basics to another reinforced his own understanding and cultivated leadership. Knowledge traveled in a clear, cascading flow, from sensei to senior students, and from them to the juniors. This entire environment was a continuous lesson in the core values of bushido. The bow upon entering the dojo reinforced respect. The silent acceptance of grueling drills cultivated endurance. The immediate obedience to the sensei's command practiced loyalty. Even the act of cleaning the hall was an exercise in mindfulness and humility, a reminder that the space you trained in deserved as much care as the art you practiced within it. Every interaction, from the way you lined up to the way you received a practice weapon, was a ritual reinforcing the social and moral fabric of the samurai's world. The dojo was a forge, and its rigid hierarchy was the hammer that shaped not just skilled fighters, but disciplined members of a very strict society. A samurai's discipline was not a phase of life, but life itself, a path that began almost as soon as a child could walk. For a boy born into a samurai family, play was training, and training was his future. By the age of 3, he might be given a small, blunt mock sword, often made of wood. This was not a toy in the casual sense, it was his first tool, an object to be treated with respect. Under the watchful eye of his father or a senior retainer, he would learn the proper way to hold it, to carry it, and to bow with it. His games were imitations of the adults around him, practicing stances and mimicking the cuts he saw in the courtyard. This early immersion was about building a relationship with the weapon, making it feel as natural as his own hand, and instilling the unspoken understanding that his entire identity was tied to the way of the warrior. The formal transition from child to student came with the ceremony of genpuku, usually around the age of 15. This was a pivotal rite of passage. The young man would have his forelocks shaved off and his hair styled in the adult manner. He would be presented with his first real set of adult clothing, and most importantly, his first full-sized lev katana. The ceremony was a public declaration. The boy was now a man, a member of the warrior class with all its duties and perils. His training immediately intensified and formalized. He would be placed under the direct tutelage of a skilled sensei. either within his own household or by being sent to a renowned dojo or to serve as a page in a lord's castle. Here, the playful imitation ended. Every action was now measured against the stark realities of combat and honor. His days became a relentless cycle of the very disciplines we've traced, from pre-dawn meditation to weapon drills, but now performed with the weight of adult expectation. These were the peak training years, a period of obsessive, single-minded development where his body was pushed to its limits, and his mind was hardened through repetition and philosophy. Yet the path did not end with youthful prowess. As a samurai aged, the nature of his practice evolved. The explosive power of his 20s might fade, but his value and his understanding deepened. He could no longer rely on sheer speed or strength. Instead, his training became more refined, more internal. He focused on perfecting technique over power, on strategy over aggression, and on the subtle nuances of timing and perception that only decades of experience could teach. An older samurai might spend more time in meditation, studying strategy, or mentoring the next generation. His daily kata became less about building muscle and more about maintaining the fluid connection between mind and body, preserving the sharpness of his instincts. Practice became a duty to his legacy and a spiritual pursuit, a way to remain connected to his core identity even as his role shifted from frontline fighter to advisor, general, or teacher. This lifelong commitment reveals the true scope of samurai discipline. It was not a skill set acquired and then set aside. From the first wooden sword to the final, deliberate stroke of a calligraphy brush in old age, it was a continuous process of becoming. The training adapted to each season of life, but its purpose remained constant, to forge and then continually polish the character of the warrior. The dojo was not just a room, it was the entire lifespan. But all the perfect form in the world meant nothing until it was tested against a resisting opponent. The final crucible of daily training was the reality of sparring, where theory met the unpredictable chaos of another human will. This was not the choreographed dance of kata. It was live, reactive, and often brutally physical. To bridge the gap between practice and the battlefield, samurai developed methods for testing their skills with genuine intensity, while still managing the very real risk of serious injury. One of the most sophisticated systems was the use of protective armor, known as bagu, in sparring that closely resembled what we now call kendo. This gear was a marvel of pragmatic design. A padded helmet or men protected the head and shoulders. A thick chest protector, the do, shielded the torso. Heavy padded gloves, coat, guarded the hands and wrists, and an apron-like tear hung to protect the waist and groin. Clad in this armor, warriors could engage in full speed, full power strikes with bamboo shinai, aiming for specific, predefined target areas on the head, wrists, torso, and throat. The sound was a relentless cacophony of clacking bamboo and shouted calls, a controlled simulation of dueling pressure. Here, they learned to judge distance against a moving, intelligent foe, to feint and counter, and to absorb the shock of a solid hit without breaking focus. The goal was to make the right action under stress, to see openings and exploit them in the blink of an eye, all while maintaining proper form and a clear mind. Yet even this was considered by some to be too safe, too stylized. For a more raw and punishing test, they turned to full-contact drills with the solid oak bakken. Sparring with these heavy wooden swords was a different kind of ordeal entirely. There was no scoring of points, only the stark reality of impact. While they avoided strikes to the head, blows to the arms, legs, and body were delivered with substantial force. A well-placed strike from a bakken could crack ribs, break bones, or leave deep, bruising welts that lasted for weeks. The pain was not an accident, it was the point. It taught the warrior to defend with absolute commitment, to never leave a limb exposed, and to understand the real consequence of a failed block. It cultivated a level of toughness and resilience that no padded drill could replicate. Every bruise was a lesson written on the body, a visceral reminder of a mistake that in real combat would have meant a severed limb or death. This acceptance of risk was fundamental. Training injuries, from broken fingers and concussions to more severe wounds, were a common and expected part of the path. A dojo floor might be stained with the blood of a split lip or a cracked knuckle. This harsh environment served a profound psychological purpose. It stripped away any illusion of safety. A man who has felt the sting of a wooden sword on his forearm understands viscerally what a steel blade can do. It inoculated him against the shock and panic of a real fight. When he eventually stepped onto a dueling ground with a live blade, the situation was terrifyingly familiar. The adrenaline, the pain of a near miss, the jarring impact of a parry. These were all sensations he had experienced 100 times before in the dojo. The chaos was not new, it was just more final. This daily exposure to controlled violence and real physical consequence was what transformed practice technique into fighting instinct. It was the final, essential polish on the sword's edge, ensuring that when the moment of truth arrived, the warrior was not practicing for combat. He was simply doing what he did every single day. This relentless machine of flesh and bone required constant, careful fueling. The samurai's diet was a reflection of his entire philosophy, built on balance, simplicity, and functionality. He did not feast on rich meats or lavish meals. His daily sustenance was a simple, frugal affair, designed to support endurance and clear-mindedness. The foundation was rice, specifically unpolished brown rice, which provided slow-burning carbohydrates for sustained energy. This was accompanied by seasonal vegetables, pickled or fresh, offering essential vitamins and minerals. Protein came primarily from fish, both fresh and dried, and from the fermented soybean paste called miso, used in soups. Meat, particularly red meat, was consumed sparingly, often reserved for special occasions or as a luxury for the highest-ranking lords. This was partly due to Buddhist influences that discouraged the taking of mammalian life, and partly due to practical economics, as raising cattle for food was inefficient in a land better suited for rice cultivation. The result was a diet high in complex carbohydrates, moderate in protein, and low in fat, almost perfectly engineered for the long, grueling days of training. Meals were eaten with mindfulness, another extension of their discipline. They understood that a sluggish body from overeating, or a foggy mind from poor nutrition, could be as fatal as a dull blade. Their physical care extended far beyond the training grounds into the realm of medicine. When injuries inevitably occurred, from a twisted ankle during footwork drills to a deep bruise from a Bakken strike, they turned to a sophisticated system of traditional healing. Herbal medicine, known as kampo, was deeply studied. A samurai, or more often a dedicated healer in his retinue, would use plants like ginger for inflammation, mugwort for moxibustion to stimulate healing, and a vast pharmacopoeia of roots and barks to treat everything from fever to fatigue. They were also masters of practical trauma care. The art of sakatsu, or bone setting, was a highly developed skill. Practitioners, who were often samurai themselves, learned to diagnose and realign broken bones and dislocated joints through precise manipulation, using wooden splints and tight bandaging to immobilize the injury. Massage and acupuncture were common treatments for the chronic muscle soreness that came with their profession, helping to maintain flexibility and circulation. This holistic approach to the body, from the food that built it to the methods that repaired it, was not about luxury or comfort, it was about maintenance. The samurai viewed his physical form as the single most important tool he would ever own, more vital than any sword or spear. A chipped blade could be resharpened by a smith, but a broken body, poorly mended, could end a career and a life. Every bowl of rice, every application of a herbal poultice, was an act of strategic preservation, ensuring the machine was ready to perform, day after day, for a lifetime of service. The true measure of a samurai's skill was not proven in a robe, but beneath the crushing weight of his own protection. Every technique he mastered in light clothing faced its ultimate test when performed in full battle armor, the yoroi. This was not a suit of clothes, it was a portable fortress, a layered construction of lacquered iron and leather plates, silk cords, and heavy fabric that could weigh between 40 and 60 pounds. Simply wearing it was a workout. Breathing became a conscious effort, movement turned sluggish, and the world narrowed to the slit of his helmet's visor. The very tools that saved his life on the battlefield became his greatest obstacles in training. His daily regimen, therefore, included dedicated sessions performed entirely in yoroi, forcing his body to adapt to the reality of fighting while encumbered. Swordsmanship transformed completely. The fluid, sweeping cuts of kenjutsu had to be shortened and powered from the core. He could no longer rely on the whipping speed of his wrists. The armor's rigid sleeves and gloves made that impossible. Instead, he learned to generate power through a solid, grounded stance and a powerful twist of the hips, driving the sword in more direct, economical arcs. Drawing the katana itself, the smooth iaijutsu motion, became a monumental task. He practiced for hours the specific angle and force needed to clear the blade from the scabbard without catching it on the armored plates of his thigh or sleeve. Archery in armor was a feat of immense strength and patience. Drawing the long yumi bow required even more raw power to overcome the restriction of the chest plate and shoulder guards. He had to find a new anchor point for the string, and his entire posture adjusted to compensate for the weight pulling him backward. On horseback, the challenge multiplied. Mounting the horse alone in 60 pounds of iron was a skill in itself, often requiring a boost from a retainer. Once in the saddle, he and his horse both felt the extra burden. The animal's gait changed, its stamina decreased, and every maneuver required more effort from both partners. They practiced for hours, building the horse's strength and the rider's balance until they moved again as one cohesive unit, albeit a much heavier one. To prepare for this, samurai engaged in brutal conditioning drills while fully armored. They would perform squats, lunges, and lifts, not with modern weights, but with the very equipment they would wear into battle. They practiced getting up quickly from a fall, a critical skill since being knocked down in armor was like being trapped in a heavy shell. They ran in it, short, jarring sprints that built the specific muscle groups needed to charge an enemy line. This was functional strength training in its purest form. The goal was not to move despite the armor, but to move with it, to make its weight a part of his own body. Through this relentless, grueling practice, the samurai achieved a kind of armored grace. What looked impossibly cumbersome to an outsider became, for him, a second skin. The restricted movement forged a more powerful, deliberate style of combat. Every technique was stripped to its essential, powerful core, because anything superfluous was wasted energy he could not afford. His daily training in yoroi was the final guarantee that the beautiful, precise forms of the dojo would not shatter under the brutal, weighted reality of war. This constant confrontation with the armored self led to an even deeper internal confrontation. Beneath the helmet's metal and the layers of silk, every samurai carried a single, unwavering thought, his own inevitable death. This was not a morbid obsession, but the core of their psychological armor. They practiced a form of meditation far more intense than simple stillness, a deliberate and daily visualization of their own end. In the quiet of morning zazen, a warrior would not just clear his mind, he would fill it with the most terrifying scenario imaginable. He would picture the battle tomorrow, see the enemy's blade arcing toward his neck, feel the cold steel bite, and envision his body falling to the earth. He would sit with that image, breathe through the primal fear it triggered, and accept it completely. This grueling mental exercise had a singular, practical purpose: to extinguish the fear of death before he ever stepped onto the battlefield. By dying 1,000 times in his mind, he sought to rob the actual moment of its power to paralyze him. This philosophy was crystallized in a radical concept: to die before going into battle. It sounds like a paradox, but for the samurai, it was the ultimate strategy for freedom. The idea was to mentally sever all attachment to life, to family, to honor, even to the desire for victory. In the meditation hall, he would symbolically perform his own funeral, letting go of his identity and his future. Once this internal death was accomplished, the man who walked into combat was already free. He had nothing left to lose, and therefore, nothing left to fear. This created a warrior capable of breathtaking clarity and commitment. With the anxiety of self-preservation removed, His mind could focus entirely on the task, his movements could flow without hesitation, and his tactics could be utterly ruthless because they were no longer clouded by personal desperation. He could hold a defensive line to the last man without thought of retreat, or launch a suicidal charge if it served his lord's strategy. This mental state was not about seeking death, but about removing its shadow as a distraction. A samurai who had made peace with his end could truly appreciate the cherry blossom in that moment, precisely because he understood its fleeting beauty mirrored his own. He could act with a purity of intention that was both terrible and beautiful. His daily meditation on mortality was, therefore, the most advanced form of training he ever undertook. It sharpened not his sword arm, but his spirit, forging a mind that could remain calm and decisive in the very face of oblivion. This was the final piece of the machine, the psychological keystone that allowed all the physical skill, strategy, and discipline to function under the ultimate pressure. But this iron discipline was not a single, unchanging mold. The samurai's daily grind shifted dramatically across centuries, shaped by the brutal demands of war and the rigid structures of peace. In the chaotic maelstrom of the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, training was stripped to its raw, pragmatic core. This was a time of constant civil war, where domains rose and fell with the seasons. A samurai's life was measured in battles survived. His daily practice had one overwhelming purpose: battlefield survival. There was little time for the refined arts of calligraphy or the lengthy rituals of the tea ceremony. Every morning's drill was a direct rehearsal for the afternoon's combat. Training was often conducted in full armor, because you might need to fight in it at any moment. Sparring was less about points and form, and more about testing techniques that could quickly disable or kill an armored opponent. The focus was on weapons of war, the spear for holding lines, the bow for ranged attacks, and the sword for the brutal close-quarters melee that followed. Schools of combat, known as ryuha, flourished, but their teachings were fiercely practical, trade secrets passed from father to son or from a master to a trusted band of warriors. A clan's survival depended on these methods, so they were guarded closely. The famed Taikta clan, for example, built its legend on its formidable cavalry, the Red Armor units. Their daily training would have been obsessed with mounted archery and coordinated lance charges, forging a terrifying synergy between man and horse that could shatter enemy lines. Contrast this with the profound peace of the Edo period that followed. For over 250 years, Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. Large-scale warfare vanished. The samurai's role transformed from frontline warrior to bureaucrat and peacekeeper. His sword became more a symbol of status than a tool for daily use. In response, his training evolved. Without the immediate threat of war, the martial arts, now called bushido, turned inward. The focus shifted from battlefield efficiency to personal cultivation, dueling prowess, and the perfection of form. Dueling, often to first blood or to prove a point of honor, became a primary concern. This gave rise to incredibly refined, almost philosophical schools of swordsmanship. The Yaju Shinkage Ryu, which served as instructors to the Tokugawa shoguns, emphasized strategy and mental domination over an opponent, a cerebral approach suited to the political intrigues of a stable court. Meanwhile, the more austere Ito Ryu focused on the decisive, single cut as an expression of spiritual clarity. Training became more formalized, with detailed etiquette, standardized kata, and a greater emphasis on the spiritual and moral lessons of bushido. The pen truly began to balance the sword, as samurai spent as much time in academies studying Confucian classics as they did in the dojo. Even the great clans developed distinct cultural identities: the scholarly mori, the martial shimazu, each fostering ryuha that reflected their history and values. So the samurai's daily routine was never a fixed monument. It was a river, constantly changing its course to navigate the landscape of its time, from the bloody, pragmatic forges of eternal war to the polished, deliberate halls of enduring peace. The echo of clashing bakken did not fade into silence. It simply changed its form. You can hear it today in the sharp shout of a kendo practitioner, in the whisper of a blade being drawn in the Iaido, and in the deep silence that follows the release of a kudo arrow. The samurai's relentless daily discipline did not vanish with the last katana. It evolved, finding a new purpose in the modern world. What was once a matter of life and death is now a path of personal cultivation, a living bridge to a formidable past. In dojos and training halls across the globe, the ancient methods are preserved with meticulous care, but their core intent has transformed. Take kendo, the way of the sword. When you step onto the floor today, you wear the same bagu armor and wield the same bamboo shinai. You learn the same footwork, the same precise strikes to the men, coat, and do. The relentless focus on mai, combative distance, is identical, yet the context is utterly different. For the samurai, a failed block meant a severed limb. For you, it means a stinging bruise and a lost point. The objective is no longer to kill, but to cultivate spirit, discipline, and respect through the intensity of combat. The ki shout is not to intimidate an enemy, but to unify your spirit with your action. Victory is measured not in a fallen foe, but in the perfection of your character. Similarly, the art of the quick draw lives on in the Iaido. A modern practitioner performs the same intricate, flowing kata, drawing, cutting, and sheathing the blade against imagined opponents. The movements are preserved down to the smallest detail, a direct transmission from centuries-old ryuha. But the sword is now blunt, an iaido made for practice, and the opponents exist only in the mind's eye. The life or death tension of a surprise encounter is gone, replaced by a profound internal meditation on form, focus, and the beauty of controlled motion. It becomes a moving zazen, where the goal is self-mastery, not survival. The samurai's connection to the bow is kept vibrantly alive in kudo. The practitioner still handles the massive, asymmetrical yumi, performs the same 8-stage shooting ritual, and seeks that state of mushin, where the arrow seems to release itself. The spiritual core, the marriage of brute force and serene focus, remains completely intact. Yet the target is no longer a commander on a distant hill or the leg of a charging horse. It is a straw mat placed 30 yards away. The ultimate purpose shifts from tactical lethality to the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty in the shot itself. The art becomes a ceremony of the self, where hitting the target is almost incidental to the quality of one's presence. Even the brutal pragmatism of close-quarters combat is preserved in modern jujutsu and its derivative, judo. The throws, joint locks, and pins are the same techniques a disarmed samurai would use to survive. But on the tatami mats today, they are practiced with control, with safety in mind, and with the explicit rule that you release a submission hold when your partner taps out. The goal is not to maim or kill, but to understand biomechanics, develop mutual welfare, and build a resilient body and mind. The modern martial artist, therefore, walks a fascinating line. They experience the exact physical and mental challenges of the samurai, the aching muscles from holding a stance, the frustration of imperfect technique, the fleeting moments of perfect flow. They inherit the rituals, the etiquette, the hierarchical structure of the dojo, and the philosophical depth of bushido. They are, in a very real sense, practicing history. But they do so within a frame of safety, sport, and personal growth. The shadow of mortality has lifted, allowing the deeper essence of the discipline, the forging of an indomitable spirit, to shine through without the stain of violence. This is the true legacy of the samurai's daily grind, not a museum piece, but a living, breathing practice that continues to shape human character, proving that the most enduring battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Their daily existence was a symphony of relentless effort, each movement a note in a lifelong pursuit of perfection. From the pre-dawn shock of cold water to the final, deliberate stroke of a calligraphy brush, the samurai's training forged a complete human instrument. It was never just about the sword. It was a holistic machine designed to synchronize the mind's clarity with the body's power, all tempered by a spirit trained in both beauty and brutal reality. They balanced the pen and the sword, the terum and the archery range, the meditation cushion and the armored drill field. This extreme, all-encompassing discipline did more than create skilled fighters. It sculpted an entire ethos, a way of being that turned individuals into pillars of a rigid society and icons of focused will. It is this total commitment, this fusion of the artistic and the martial, the spiritual and the pragmatic, that explains their enduring legend. They remind us that true mastery is not a single skill, but the integration of every facet of one's being toward a singular purpose. So we turn the question to you, after walking through the sheer scale of their daily grind, which aspect stands out? Is it the mental fortitude to meditate on one's own death, the physical endurance to train in full armor, or the artistic discipline to find serenity in a bowl of tea? Let us know your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the machinery behind the myth, subscribe for more journeys into the world's greatest historical mysteries.